Study 94, The Meaning Deficit, Why Luxury, Art and the Built Environment Are All Failing the Same Test. From the Objects of Affection collection. 3 independent trend forecasts. Vogue Business's diagnosis of a trust crisis in luxury fashion. Maddox Gallery's identification of naive authenticity as the dominant posture of the 2026 art market, and Design's reading of curated calm as the governing logic of contemporary interior design, have been treated in the trade press as discrete market signals. This study argues they are not. They are 3 expressions of a single underlying condition, the meaning deficit. Across product, canvas and space, the consumer is refusing the empty sign. Developed under the Post-Luxury Conceptual Functional Art, PLCFA, framework of the Objects of Affection collection, this study names the condition, traces its common architecture across all 3 domains, and argues that the only durable response is an object or a space or a work that has something to say and the material courage to say it. PLCFA lexicon terms in active deployment: semantic burden, hollowed object, narrative permanence, material singularity, zero-sum aura, anti-speculative autonomy. The 3 reports are one report. In early 2026, 3 authoritative publications in 3 distinct verticals arrived at strikingly convergent conclusions. Vogue Business, surveying the luxury fashion sector, identified a culture of sameness driven by LVMH and Kering's dependence on AI-optimized sales data, and reported a surging consumer demand for what it termed human touch and empathy as the antidote to sterile, predictive retail. Maddox Gallery, reporting on the art market, declared the 2026 forecast officially anti-AI, noting that collectors were prioritizing naive authenticity, naive painting and distorted portraiture, and that identity was being treated as fluid and constructed. Design, canvassing leading interior architects and designers, identified a market-wide turn from superficial opulence to what it named curated calm: dark woods, aged metals, and textured stones replacing the reflexive maximalism of the preceding decade, with the design goal no longer to occupy space but to create emotional grounding. The trade press received all 3 as evidence of parallel but separate conversations: fashion's reckoning with AI dependency, the art world's counter-reaction to generative imagery, the interior sector's post-maximalist correction. This reading is inadequate. These are not parallel conversations. They are the same sentence, spoken in 3 different rooms. The consumer is not rejecting AI. The consumer is rejecting objects that have nothing to say. The common variable across all 3 reports is not a material preference, a stylistic trend, or a market cycle correction. It is a crisis of signification. The object, whether a luxury bag, a painting, or a living room, has been progressively emptied of meaning by the same industrial logic. The substitution of signal for substance, of data-optimized surface for genuine semantic content. What Vogue Business calls the trust crisis, what Maddox calls naive authenticity, and what Design calls curated calm are not 3 trends. They are 3 names for the consumer's refusal of the hollowed object. As the OAC established in the thoughtful middle distance, this refusal has been building across every sector simultaneously. The trade press is simply registering its arrival. The architecture of the hollowed object, the PLCFA framework, has identified the hollowed object as the defining pathology of the contemporary luxury economy. An object that retains all the formal markers of value, price, heritage, craftsmanship, vocabulary, editorial coverage, while evacuating the interior condition that justifies those markers. The hollowed object is expensive but not significant. It is recognizable but not meaningful. It performs luxury without enacting it. The mechanism of hollowing. The hollowing process is neither accidental nor malicious. It is the rational output of a specific industrial model. When the dominant luxury conglomerates, LVMH and Kering being the architectonic cases, centralized creative governance under data science frameworks, they optimized for measurable signals of desirability. Logo recognition, social amplification, unit velocity, margin per touchpoint. What such frameworks cannot measure, and therefore structurally suppress, is the quality the PLCFA framework designates as semantic burden, the weight of meaning that a genuine object carries independent of its market positioning. The OAC's study Why Traditional Luxury's Route Marketing Fails to Purchase Moral Capital documents this mechanism in forensic detail. The consequence was predictable and has now arrived. LVMH reported a 15% profit drop in early 2025, Kering's revenue fell 18% in the same period, while Hermes, which has structurally resisted data-optimized expansion in favor of genuine scarcity and artisanal narrative permanence, continued to thrive. The bifurcation is not a paradox. It is the market's legibility test. As the OAC documented in luxury just split in two. One half will survive. This is a structural divergence, not a correction. The hollowed object is being systematically repriced toward its actual content value, which is zero. The same mechanism in art. In the art market, the hollowing process took a different form but followed an identical logic. The explosion of AI-generated imagery introduced a condition of aesthetic oversupply. The technically perfect image became infinitely reproducible at near zero cost. The consequence was not merely a glut of images. It was a collapse of the evidential function of craft. When perfection is effortless, perfection signals nothing. The collector purchasing a naive painting, loose line, awkward proportion, visible uncertainty of hand, is not purchasing nostalgia or primitivism. They are purchasing proof of authorship, the irreducible evidence that a decision-making consciousness was present in the making of the object. The OAC's The Algorithm of the Hand established this argument at the structural level before the Maddox report confirmed it at the market level. Human imperfection is now the primary luxury signal in a post-AI image economy. Maddox Gallery's forecast characterized the 2026 art market's turn with precision. Collectors are paying premiums for work that unmistakably proves a human was here. This is not aesthetics. This is epistemology. The collector asks a preliminary question before any question of taste. Is a claim being made? Does this object have something at stake? The naive painting, in the hands of artists deploying intentional imperfection with genuine conviction, is not a rejection of skill. It is the deployment of visible process as the primary semantic burden of the work. The imperfection is the argument, the same mechanism in space. Interior design completed the same journey through different material. The decade of maximalism, surfaces crowded with statement objects, rooms engineered to photograph, space treated as a platform for conspicuous display, was the spatial equivalent of the hollowed object. It performed richness without enacting it. Design's 2026 survey found designers universally forecasting a turn to spaces that hold and support human time, rather than deliver a wow effect. The distinction is not aesthetic minimalism versus maximalism. It is the difference between a room that makes a claim on the person who inhabits it, and a room that merely performs for whoever might be watching. This is the spatial register of what OAC's The Architecture of Absence identified in Hermes's La Pelota installation. Space as a structural argument for the object, not a spectacle surrounding it. The material choices that Design's designers converged upon, dark woods, aged metals, textured stone, are not arbitrary. They are materials that carry what the PLCFA framework calls material singularity, the irreducible specificity of a substance that cannot be replicated, substituted, or algorithmically approximated. A particular walnut burl grain is exactly one thing. A particular worn brass fitting carries the legibility of time. These materials resist the hollowed object condition because they cannot be optimized away from themselves. As OAC's study of Joe Dowsett's columns collection argued, the endurance of material is the only honest sustainability argument left, and it is also the only honest meaning argument left. The meaning deficit as a structural condition. The meaning deficit is the condition in which objects, works, and spaces have been progressively stripped of their capacity to bear genuine semantic burden, to mean something that matters to the person who encounters them, and replaced with the simulation of that capacity. It is not a crisis of quality in the conventional sense. The products produced by the major luxury conglomerates are, by most material measures, well made. The interiors of the maximalist decade were, by most technical measures, accomplished. The AI-generated images that saturated the visual culture were, by any mechanical measure, flawless. The deficit is not in execution, it is in content. The luxury consumer of 2026 does not want a better product. They want a product that has an argument to make. The theoretical grounding for this condition was established in Jean Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality, the state in which symbolic representations become more powerful than the realities they were meant to represent. In the luxury sector, brands ceased to sell objects and retooled to deliver narratives. The problem was not that narrative was added to object. The problem was that narrative replaced object, that the story became a substitute for the substance rather than its articulation. The simulacrum of value displaced value itself. The OAC's engagement with Baudrillard's framework, developed across the simulacrum of status and the thoughtful middle distance, established this as the foundational pathology of the luxury economy before the Vogue Business Trust audit confirmed it empirically. This is the precise diagnostic language the PLCFA framework was developed to address. The custodian's contract, the house's foundational doctrine, holds that an object is legitimate only when its narrative is inseparable from its material form. The story is not adjacent to the object. The story is in the object. When that integration is absent, when narrative is applied as a layer over an otherwise inert product, the result is not a luxury object. It is a hollowed object wearing luxury's vocabulary. Why the three sectors failed simultaneously. The simultaneity of the trust crisis in luxury fashion, the naive authenticity turn in the art market, and the curated calm movement in interior design is not coincidental. All three sectors were subject to the same underlying pressure: the industrialization of the taste formation process, data-driven creative direction in fashion, algorithmic image generation in art, and the commodification of wow aesthetics in interiors all participated in the same substitution. They replaced the individual decision-making consciousness, with its capacity for risk, error, conviction, and genuine semantic commitment, with a system optimized for the measurable and the reproducible. Byung-Chul Han's diagnosis of the burnout society and the aesthetic of smoothness provides the philosophical infrastructure for this understanding. The smooth surface requires no response because it makes no demand. The consumer's refusal, arriving across all three sectors in 2026, is the reassertion of a prior demand, that the things they live with, the works they collect, and the spaces they inhabit should have been made by someone who meant something by making them. The demand is not for handcraft as such. It is not nostalgia. It is not anti-technology. It is a demand for the presence of what the PLCFA framework designates as anti-speculative autonomy. The maker's refusal to pre-optimize the object for any market, the willingness to make something that holds a position regardless of whether that position is commercially legible. The consumer as semiotician, the academic literature on luxury consumption, has long established that the luxury object functions primarily as a sign, a vehicle for the transmission of social meaning between makers, owners, and observers. What the 2026 convergence signals is a qualitative shift in how that semiotic function is being evaluated. The consumer has become a more sophisticated semiotician than the brands anticipated. Semiotic theory and sign value, the analytical vocabulary that Jean Baudrillard deployed to diagnose the luxury economy, are now being applied intuitively by consumers who simply know without theoretical apparatus when a sign is backed by content and when it is not. The earlier luxury consumer, the aspirational buyer who drove the industry's explosive growth from 2019 through 2023, was willing to accept the sign at face value. The logo carried its referent reliably enough. The brand story, however synthetic, was sufficient scaffolding for the purchase decision. By 2025, this scaffolding had begun to collapse. Vogue Business reported luxury fatigue as consumers increasingly questioned the value for money offered by major houses. Searches for designer logo items dropped nearly 30% by 2025, a figure the OAC's Poet Core study documented as the statistical confirmation of a semiotic revolt already visible in consumer behavior. The spectacle of status by brand was losing semiotic traction. What the consumer was losing was not appetite for luxury. It was tolerance for zero-sum aura, the condition in which an object's perceived distinction is borrowed entirely from the brand apparatus rather than generated by the object itself. The object with zero-sum aura has no meaning independent of its label. Remove the logo and nothing remains. The collector gravitating toward naive painting, the design client requesting dark wood and textured stone, the luxury consumer returning to Hermes, all are seeking objects with positive aura density, meaning that the object generates from itself that cannot be extracted by removing the brand's name. What the naive painting already knows: the naive painting is the most theoretically transparent of the three cases because it makes its argument visible. The loose line is the argument, the uncomfortable proportion is the argument, the visible uncertainty of hand is the argument. The OAC's foundational study, The Algorithm of the Hand, established this as a structural condition rather than an aesthetic preference. In a post-AI image economy, intentional imperfection is the primary form of authorship documentation available to the maker. The imperfection is not a deficiency. It is the primary carrier of semantic burden. This is why the anti-AI character of the 2026 art market is philosophically deeper than a reaction to image quality. The collector is not rejecting AI because AI makes inferior images. The collector is rejecting AI because AI cannot make a commitment. The AI-generated image has no stake in its own existence. It cannot be held to its content. It carries no semantic burden because there was no decision-making subject who bore the cost of the decisions that produced it. As the OAC documented in the Banksy corpus, specifically the named Ghost and the forensic ledger, the art market's most fundamental transaction is not the exchange of an image for money. It is the exchange of a claim for custodianship. The naive painting, by contrast, is entirely accountable. The mark is traceable to a hand. The hand is traceable to a consciousness. The consciousness is traceable to a position. The imperfection is not the absence of meaning. It is the proof of it. What the Dezeen room already knows. The interior design turn described by Dezeen operates by the same logic in material terms. The designer replacing chrome brass with aged metal, substituting walnut burl for engineered veneer, choosing textured stone over polished composite, is not making an aesthetic choice. They are making an epistemological one. The aged metal carries the record of its own history. The burl grain is irreducibly itself. The textured stone will not render the same in any other context. These materials make claims that cannot be revoked by the next trend cycle. They possess material singularity, the property the PLCFA framework designates as the irreducible ground of genuine object value, as articulated in the OAC's study of Herms's La Pelota, and its precise deployment of Wabi-Sabi principles as a structural design argument. The goal Dezeen's leading designers articulate, spaces that hold and support human time, is the spatial analogue of the custodian's contract. The room that accepts the constraint of being one specific thing rather than performing generically as luxury space is the room that passes the same test the naive painting passes and the Herms object passes. It has accepted semantic burden. The curated calm movement at its most rigorous is not a style. It is the built environment's equivalent of anti-speculative autonomy. The aura problem, what cannot be borrowed. The concept of aura, as Walter Benjamin formulated it, designates the quality of presence that a work possesses by virtue of its unique existence in a particular time and place, the record of its own history embedded in its material. Benjamin's central thesis in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction was that mechanical reproduction destroys aura by making the original infinitely substitutable. The 2026 convergence is the market's confirmation of this thesis at scale. When AI-generated images achieve perfect technical reproduction, when luxury products are optimized by identical data systems, when premium spaces are designed according to the same algorithm of maximum visual impact, the result is a culture-wide zero-sum aura condition. The full study is available at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.